Now the thing is with herringbone stitch is that you'll really want to whack up the needle size from what's generally recommended. So i.e. this yarn recommends a 10mm needle. However, I experimented with, you know, I wanted to get a nice feel to the scarf, a nice drape. So I've ended up using a 15mm circular needle for this project, and that's intentional. You need to whack the needle size up to get a nice pliable fabric, otherwise it'll be too dense. So anyway, let's get on with the video tutorial. For this project I'm using Freedom Wool by Twice of Stamford. So what you need to do is look for a similar ball band tension, and note that in stockinette stitch this uses a 10mm needle. So begin this scarf by casting on 200 stitches with a 10mm circular needle. What I'm about to show you is the equivalent to what would be a row 1, and from row 1 onwards we'll be working with a 15mm circular needle. Now this is a 2-row repeat, so this would be the equivalent to the very first row once you've cast on 200 stitches. Now note, I'm going into the back of those first 2 stitches, look. And what I'm going to do is basically slip one of those stitches off. So I'm releasing one of the stitches, but keeping one of the stitches on the left needle. And I'm going to repeat that sequence throughout the entire row. So I'm going back through 2 stitches and pulling the through, but instead I'm using my index finger, look, to flip one of those stitches off and keep the second stitch on the left needle. So if I try and zoom in a tiny bit, I'll show this a few times. So you're going through 2 stitches through the backs, bringing the yarn through, using your index finger to flip only 1 stitch, and again repeating, going into the backs of the next 2 stitches and releasing 1 stitch at a time from the left needle. And you just keep going with that repeat, flipping 1 stitch off at a time. Now each row takes me approximately half an hour to do, so I'll show a few more stitches, working through the backs there, releasing 1 stitch and repeating. But then I'll jump to the end of the row just to show you how we finish. So down to the last 2 stitches here. Now we're left with 1, which we just work through the back of that stitch. So that's how you end row 1. Now we can turn the work. Now ready to start a wrong side row here, row 2. Principle is very similar. We're not going through the backs, however, but we are just as if to purl 2 together and releasing 1 stitch off the left needle, keeping the second stitch on the left needle and repeating that sequence throughout. So as if to purl 2 together, release 1 stitch, keep the second stitch, and keep going with that repeat throughout the whole row, purling 2 together, pardon me, releasing 1 stitch, keeping the other, purling 2 together, releasing 1 stitch, keeping the other. So I've jumped to the end of row 2. I thought I'd show a few more repeats and what happens when you get to that last stitch. So look, I'm down to my last 3 stitches. Now 2. And with the very last stitch, I'm just purling, and that's row 2, and you repeat rows 1 and 2 until you develop a nice width for your scarf. Now I'm aiming for 10 inches with mine. That's 25 centimetres, which that's good. Now through trial and error I've discovered that my cast off or bind off looks better on a smaller needle, so I'm using a 10mm needle here to bind off, so you may want to experiment with that. Now we're going to cast off in pattern, so what that means is, again, as if to knit 2 together through the back of the loops, we're slipping one of those stitches off, retaining the other, repeating that twice, and then we can do our first cast off stitch with the right needle, or bind off, like so. And we're just going to repeat that sequence throughout the remaining stitches. So we're knitting 2 together through the back of the loops, slipping one of the stitches off the left needle, and at the same time casting off. Completing your pattern, then binding off. But like I say, you might be fine on 15mm needles here casting off, but my bind off was looking a bit loose and I didn't want it to curl, so I thought I would tighten up the needle that I used for binding off purposes. So I'd like to thank you for watching.